everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us today for the 7th annual meeting of the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, hosted by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization. During this session, we will be accepting questions from all of you. To ask a question, simply go to the question submission area toward the bottom of your screen or access the question submission page from the program menu. We look forward to receiving your questions. And we would now like to start plenary session 2, Finance for Innovation. First, I would like to introduce the moderator of this session, Mr. Jon Moore. Mr. Moore is Chief Executive Officer of Bloomberg New Energy Forum. The speakers for this session are Ms. Aleksandra Tomczak, Member of the Cabinet of the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, in charge of the European Green Deal. Ms. Isabelle Laurent, Deputy Treasurer and Head of Funding of European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Mr. Mark Christopher Lewis, Global Head of Sustainability Research of BNP Paribas Asset Management. Mr. Mungo Park, Founder and Chair of Innovator Capital Limited. And now I would like to ask Mr. Jon Moore to moderate this session. Mr. Moore, if you please.
Thank you very much, and welcome to our Finance for Innovation session of the 7th ICEF event. I've been involved many years now, and last year actually we were all there in person. It was the Rugby World Cup, and Typhoon Hagibis also visited us. So it was a very eventful week. I'm hoping you're also having not quite so eventful, but also a very interesting and stimulating week. Green growth needs innovation, and we see that very clearly from what's happened with COVID. You know, demand has shrunk and emissions have shrunk, but so has the economy been hurt. So what we know is we need to keep growing the economy and also reducing emissions. And that's really what we're going to be talking about here today, and particularly trying to understand how finance can play a part. So public and private finance, how can it play a part? And how has COVID changed things? What opportunities, what challenges does that present? And also in line with the theme of the conference, you know, does gender play a part in that? We have some great guests. You've seen them all introduced. It ranges from many, many different aspects of the whole value chain, financing value chain. So we're going to understand a lot of different perspectives. Just to set the scene, I just wanted to pass on a few facts, actually. I mean, the beginning of the year was Davos, where climate was the key topic. And of course, since March, 6 months now, the pandemic has been really the sort of, you know, the thing that's mainly been in the news. And we've seen the impact either be a sort of single wave impact on some things like the Chinese economy or even power demand, so deep down drop and coming back. And then some other things have had an ongoing impact, so things like international air travel, public transport, even oil demand has not come back. So we're very much still in the moment of COVID, and we're going to be touching on that. Of the stimulus packages, there's been 12 trillion in stimulus, 159 billion of that, so only 1% has been targeted at green, whilst 7% has been targeted at CO2 intensive industries. So there's still a long way to go in terms of what stimulus packages can do, and we'll touch on that too. Some of the renewable energy industries have proven to be quite resilient. Electric vehicle sales are going to be up by 7% this year, whilst the whole market will be down 23%. And renewable power generation has proven to be extremely resilient. And also governments have also made a lot of commitments. In 1 week in September alone, the EU upped its target to 55% from 1990, from 40%. California vowed to remove ICE vehicles and go 100% electric for sales by 2035. Michigan set a 2050 target. Michigan's the size of Thailand or Sweden by GDP. And also China said by 2060 it would be carbon neutral. So some amazing commitments have been made. On green bonds have now cumulatively passed the $1 trillion mark, so up 12% this year. And if you include sustainable debt, that's now up to $2 trillion. So again, money has been flowing into the green economy, let's say. ESG funds are also up. So the monthly run rate is about 3.5 times this year than last year. And finally, research that you may have heard about earlier today on the impact of gender on business performance would have shown you that companies with greater than 30% females on the board have greater disclosure. So they're being more open and honest, and also have taken their emissions down. So they're actually better at managing down emissions. And again, we'll touch on that topic. So we have a very interesting session. First off, we're going to have some opening statements, and I'm going to hand over now to Aleksandra Tomczak to start those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jon, and good morning, good afternoon to my fellow panelists and the audience in Japan or wherever you are. I am delighted to be with you today to present the government perspective from the European Union, where we have recently adopted the European Green Deal as one of our two priorities for Europe for the next 5 years. And as part of this green transition, our aim is, well, first to become the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. And second, to also make Europe a modern, resource efficient and competitive economy where our economic growth is decoupled from resource use. So the Green Deal is also Europe's new growth strategy. It aims to transform our society into one which is fair and prosperous and based on innovation, technological leadership and sustainable investments. Can I move to next slide, please? The Green Deal offers quite a novel approach which combines not only climate policy, but also environment, transport, energy and agriculture. So our aim is not only to eliminate our impact on climate within the next 30 years, but also on the environment and to stop the biodiversity loss. But as you can imagine, making Europe sustainable and climate neutral will require a lot of investments. And I guess with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, it has been sort of a litmus test for Europe, for our commitment to climate neutrality. But instead of backtracking on this commitment, the European response has been quite unprecedented. We recently adopted a 750 billion euros recovery package, and the EU leaders confirmed our goal to become climate neutral by 2050. So the crisis which is ongoing or coming in the future, we see it as an opportunity to build back better rather than building again the old economy. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So what we often hear from investors is that what they need most is investor certainty. They need clear regulations, they need rules which don't change over time, and clear objectives. And this is what we are doing in Europe. So our current climate targets for 2030 would create a risk of locking us into unsustainable investments. The existing target would only achieve around 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That's why one of the first things we did as the Green Deal cabinet, we proposed to make the 2050 climate neutrality target legally binding. It binds the EU and it binds the EU member states. And what we also did in September this year was to propose new targets for 2030, which Jon already mentioned. So instead of reducing our emissions by 40%, we are now proposing to reduce them by 55%. And we consider that these targets are in line with the Paris Agreement and the goals of the Paris Agreement. And of course, as you can see on this diagram, this will require all the sectors to be part of this new ambition, especially the energy sector, which still represents 75% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the key first actions that we are all taking collectively in Europe is to address our use of fossil fuels. And we know that by 2030, for example, the use of coal in the EU has to decrease by 70% in comparison to 2015 levels. So we know that there is no more space left for coal in our energy mix. Even the most efficient supercritical and ultra supercritical plants don't really fit with this vision. And today, out of the 27 member states of the EU, 9 are no longer using coal. 10 have already committed to phasing out coal, most of them before 2030. 2 member states are considering coal phase out, and only 4 have no phase out commitments right now. But in order to ensure that we can go in that direction, we are also thinking about the regions which are going to be most impacted by this change. And so we established a Just Transition Fund to help those regions which rely on fossil fuel economy to transition away from coal-based economy and value chains to a more diversified economic growth. Next slide, please. So the more ambitious targets that we're proposing for 2030 will require, we estimate, around 350 billion euros of additional investments every year in comparison to what we have been investing in the last decade. And we see that the results will be positive on the GDP and employment, and our fuel import bill will decrease. We see a saving potential of roughly 3 trillion euros by 2050. But of course, this is also a great investment challenge, and that is why in January this year we adopted a Green Deal investment plan, which has 3 dimensions. First of all, financing. We want to mobilize at least 1 trillion of sustainable investments over the next decade. And that means a greater share of spending on climate and environmental action from the EU budget than ever before, but also crowding in private funding. The second dimension is enabling framework. So we want to provide incentives to unlock and redirect both public and private investments. And for this, we will provide tools for investors by putting sustainable finance at the heart of the financial system. We will also encourage green budgeting and procurement and design ways to facilitate procedures to approve our state aid for just transition regions. The third dimension is practical support. Very often, successful recovery is built on a pipeline of sustainable projects, and that is why we will provide a lot of technical assistance to plan, design, and execute sustainable projects. Next slide, please. Of course, designing, let's say, separate tools is perhaps not enough. So one of the things we are also undertaking is to mainstream climate action across all of our policies and funding instruments. For the next EU budget, we made a commitment that 25% of this budget should be spent on climate action. The recovery fund that we recently adopted, the 750 billion recovery fund, we have also decided that 37% of that recovery fund should go to climate purposes. We also run a number of EU funds, structural funds, which are supposed to reduce the differences between regions in Europe, which will help those which are perhaps have different starting points to do the green transition. And we established the Just Transition Fund, which I mentioned earlier. We also have dedicated funds for technology development from hydrogen, CCUS. These are our Horizon Europe funds and the Innovation Fund. Also, as part of the Common Agricultural Policy, we will make sure that around 40% of the total envelope we have for our agricultural policy is spent on climate-related objectives. And then private investments, which of course are, let's say, the focus of this discussion. We know that some of these investments will entail more risk than the private sector can bear alone, and that is why we want to use public funds in a targeted manner to de-risk these projects and leverage private financing. And to that end, we will be providing an EU budget guarantee to partially cover the risk of financing and investment operations through InvestEU program, which is our flagship investment fund. Via this fund, we would like to raise 280 billion euros of investments in sustainable sectors over the next decades. We will also announce a sustainable finance strategy before the end of this year to help companies increase the disclosure on climate and environmental data so that the investors are fully informed about sustainable investment opportunities and can better direct their investments. We are also in the process of finalizing the EU taxonomy, which will determine whether an economic activity is environmentally sustainable. So I would like to end my presentation and move to the next slide, please, by speaking a little bit about the international implications of the Green Deal. Our first objective is really to show our global partners that it is possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero and at the same time create jobs and wealth and improve the well-being of our citizens. So we would like to see other countries follow this example and commit to climate neutrality by 2050. And we see that this wave of commitments is already starting. By raising our ambition to 55% reduction by 2030, we have essentially doubled our ambition for the EU's nationally determined contribution in the context of the international climate negotiations. And we hope that this can create a good momentum for the upcoming UNFCCC meeting. And we strongly believe that all countries, and especially the G20 members, will need to come forward with much more ambitious actions if we are really serious about preventing the catastrophic consequences of climate change. And we as the EU will be using all our policy instruments and diplomacy to promote increased action, but also continue to foster the multilateral rule-based cooperation. And with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning if you're in Europe, and good afternoon if you're in Asia. As the Deputy Treasurer and Head of Funding at European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or EBRD, I would like to thank the ICEF organisers for inviting me to give you a quick overview of EBRD's approach to sustainability and inclusion. For those who don't know, EBRD is a supranational institution founded in 1991 after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and in response to the breakup of the formerly communist Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union to help promote the transition to open market-based economies. While transition for most of the bank's first 20 years seemed to be understood in terms of shifting from state-planned public sector economies to those with an expanding, productive, competitive and entrepreneurial private sector, the jolt, which came in the form of the global financial crisis in 2008, gave us a chance to reassess and redefine what we understood to be the attributes of sustainable transition, which can be captured through 6 qualities: competitive, well-governed, green, inclusive, resilient, and integrated. The international treaty that established EBRD mandated us to achieve transition through project finance and equity investments, predominantly in the private sector, which were all to be screened to ensure that they promoted environmentally sound and sustainable development. This has been achieved through ensuring that our investments are consistent with our rigorous environmental and social policy and performance requirements. While such assessments may be deemed akin to the new EU taxonomy's notion of do no significant harm, EBRD is one of the largest investors in environmental projects in our expanded region of almost 40 countries across 3 continents. With 34 billion euro of signed green investments to date, our Green Economy Transition Initiative seeks to build low-carbon and resilient economies through projects focused on energy efficiency, renewable energy, water, waste, sustainable transport, green buildings, and climate resilience. Along with funding green investments, we also work closely with our countries and private sector partners to create enabling environments needed for sustainable investments, such as through our nationally determined contribution support programme, which helps to develop low-carbon pathways. Our Just Transition initiative expands the green focus further to inclusion through support for workers and regional economic development, with our investments creating economic opportunities for young people, women, and people in less advanced regions. These are broadly defined as access to jobs and skills, finance and entrepreneurship, and services such as IT connectivity or improved water connections. The bank has therefore, from its very inception, embedded environmental, social, and governance criteria into all its investments through manifold policies and procedural requirements. Our green economy transition approach targets 40% of the bank's annual investment to be in projects that result in clearly identified environmental benefits and address environmental challenges that impact on economic activity and human health. All benefits must represent a meaningful shift beyond business as usual. Since 2010, EBRD has been an active issuer in the green bond market, with over 100 transactions totaling over 5.5 billion euros, all of which were issued in alignment with the green bond principles. While the proceeds from our first and largest green bond programme, in common with most of the green bond market, focused predominantly on energy efficiency and renewable energy investments, last year we introduced 2 new green bond programmes. The proceeds of our climate resilience bond focuses on our investments that seek to address physical climate risks, such as increased extreme weather events, water stress, heat stress, and soil degradation. The impetus for the investments underlying our green transition bonds was the recognition that climate-related risks will not solely be addressed through financing low-carbon or zero-carbon assets, but would require key sectors of the economy to transition from their current significant dependence on fossil fuels to low-carbon and resource-efficient operations. These are notably in the manufacturing sector, such as chemical, cement, and steel production, but also in food production and building construction. EBRD's investments in sustainability and inclusion are thus able to be supported by a global ESG-focused investor base, and we focus significantly on the Sustainable Development Goals, which require not just the sovereign sector to achieve these goals, but also the private sector to join with it. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Ohayo gozaimasu, konnichiwa, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about finance for innovation and gender diversity in the context of achieving net zero emissions and going beyond taking the next step really in the decarbonization paradigm. I am currently the head of sustainability research at BNP Paribas Asset Management, and I want to spend the next few minutes talking about a recent report I've published on the European Union's green hydrogen strategy, which we think is going to be a very important part of the ultimate decarbonization strategy, and how we can innovate in terms of scaling up the finance that will be needed for achieving the European Union's green hydrogen vision in the context of achieving net zero. And before I look at the slides, I would like to say that I think we already know how to do this. That is the good news. We know how to scale up finance to achieve a breakthrough in new decarbonization technologies, because we've already done that over the last 10 to 15 years in the EU and elsewhere in the world in the form of renewable energy. 15 years ago, many people thought renewable energy would never be competitive. It would always need subsidies. And even if you could scale it up, the electricity grid would not be able to cope with too much renewable electricity. All of those ideas have proved to be myths, and they have been debunked by reality. I would like to draw the lessons from that in the context of green hydrogen, and talk also about the European carbon pricing mechanism, the European emissions trading scheme, which I think is also going to be an important part of achieving the net zero vision. And indeed, I think also of the green hydrogen vision. The essential point I want to make is very simple, that if the public policy incentives are right, and as I say, we know how to do this because we've done it with renewable energy, but if the public policy incentives are right, then as Aleksandra said in her presentation, we can attract the private finance that will be needed ultimately. This will rely mostly on private finance, but smart public sector incentives in the form of subsidies and mandates and targeting can really help. We know that from our experience with renewable energy. So let me spend a few minutes talking about what I call the virtuous feedback loop, which is if you have the right public policy incentives, private capital will be attracted. As private capital is attracted, you start to see economies of scale and technology improvements. And this then allows the public policymakers to put in place even more ambitious targets. And you reach a point where there is a virtuous feedback loop between these two drivers, and at some point the cost starts to fall very dramatically. This is exactly what we've seen in renewable energy over the last decade. And the incredible news 2 weeks ago that a solar power deal in Portugal has become the cheapest source of new electricity in the world at 11 euros per megawatt hour. If you think that 15 years ago, solar power in Europe required subsidies of closer to 300 euros per megawatt hour, you can see what I'm talking about in terms of how smart policy can really deliver incredible real results, practical results on the ground. So with that, let me go please to the first slide. Just a quick word on the theory of carbon pricing, because carbon pricing is going to be essential in the continuing decarbonization of industry and the power sector in Europe. But it's important to understand how a carbon price can work to best effect. And I think there are three main variables that influence the effectiveness of carbon pricing. The first is that market participants need to understand the purpose for which the EU ETS has been established, i.e. the policy objective it is intended to achieve. And again, Aleksandra has prepared the way for me very, very well by saying that Europe now has a very clear long-term target, net zero emissions by 2050, and an interim target, which is currently being discussed by the Parliament and the governments, of a 55% reduction by 2030. This gives carbon market participants a very clear idea of where we are going. Secondly, market participants need to be confident that the design of the carbon pricing mechanism is effective. And I think we've learned a lot over the last 15 years since the European carbon market was put in place about how to make it as effective as possible. Most recently with the introduction of a new mechanism, the so-called Market Stability Reserve, which is a form of, if you like, central bank intervention in the market that really gives extra confidence to market participants that this market trading scheme can deliver the policy objective. And thirdly, it depends crucially, this is perhaps the most important point, on the assessment that market participants make of the political priority that is attached to achieving the ultimate objective. And again, as Aleksandra said, we are in the process in Europe of making this a formally binding legal commitment. The net zero emissions commitment by 2050 is going to be legally binding. This again will give tremendous confidence to market participants that the carbon pricing mechanism can deliver. Next slide, please. Just very quickly on this, but I think it's important to understand, the European carbon price today is very close to its all-time high. We did suffer a short period of volatility earlier in the year when the COVID pandemic led to lockdowns in Europe and the price fell to 14.3 euros a ton. But the price has recovered remarkably well since then. And that is an indication of the confidence that market participants have in the long-term commitment of the European Union to achieving net zero emissions and in the short-term effectiveness of the policy mechanism, the tool here, the carbon market mechanism to deliver that target. And so let's think about this now in terms of green hydrogen and delivering a green hydrogen economy vision. And I just want to explain some terms here. Green hydrogen is clean hydrogen. It's produced from renewable energy that power electrolyzers. Grey hydrogen is produced via a very carbon-intensive process using natural gas as the raw material. And the European Commission in July of this year set out a very clear vision for achieving commercial competitiveness for green hydrogen by 2030. And it's very similar to what the European Commission was saying 15 years ago about making renewable energy competitive. And I think, therefore, we should have confidence that this can be delivered. Next slide, please. So I think there are three reasons for thinking that green hydrogen, we know that we need green hydrogen to decarbonize fully the European economy. We need probably between 15 and 20% of final energy demand in Europe to come from green energy by 2050. And we therefore need carbon prices to rise over time so that by 2030, the carbon price is high enough to make green hydrogen competitive with grey hydrogen. We will need other public policy measures to get the cost of green hydrogen down by 2030 to a level where the carbon price can make the difference between the competitiveness of green hydrogen versus grey hydrogen. But these targets, I believe, enable us to do that. And then in my final slide, I will explain, put the numbers into context, how much money we need. I've mentioned already, the first key point is we have a target of net zero emissions and a 55% cut by 2030. That gives confidence to the market that the carbon price will need to rise. Secondly, the Commission has said very clearly, green hydrogen has to be central to the ultimate target of full decarbonisation. And if green hydrogen is ultimately going to account for 15 to 20% of the European energy system, the prerequisite, the first condition for making that possible is for green hydrogen to become viable as a feedstock in industry, because all of the hydrogen that is produced in Europe today and nearly all of the hydrogen that is used around the world today is used as an industrial feedstock, not as an energy source. And what that means is green hydrogen has to be commercially viable with grey hydrogen by 2030. And I don't have time to go into the detail here, but in my detailed report, which anybody who's interested, we can very easily send to you, we think that will require carbon prices of between 80 and 90 euros per tonne by 2030, which kind of would imply prices today of between 40 and 50 euros a tonne. So that's the kind of pricing parameter we're looking at. And the argument is green hydrogen will ultimately be driving the carbon price in Europe. It has to, otherwise we won't make net zero. Next slide, please. So just some concluding words on the amount of money we need to scale up the green hydrogen economy and how we can achieve that. And I'll conclude then with some words on gender diversity and how we are looking at that at BNP Paribas Asset Management. The European Commission estimates that we will need between 340 billion and 460 billion of investments to achieve the green hydrogen vision by 2030, and that is to produce 10 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030. We've done our own calculations and we come out really in the middle of the European Commission's estimates. We come out at about 390 billion, and you will notice fully half of that amount on the left-hand side is in the form of renewable energy capacity, dedicated renewable capacity purely for the purposes of producing green hydrogen. That's good news because we know how to do renewable energy. The cost of renewable energy is falling all the time. I mentioned the Portuguese solar project. There are many other examples, offshore wind, onshore wind. So that gives me confidence. It's a proven technology already, and we just need to scale it up for dedicated green hydrogen production purposes. The electrolyzers themselves, which are really the main technological innovation we are going to need here, it only accounts for between 10 and 20% of the total amount. So that really shouldn't be too much of a challenge. And then the transport, distribution, and storage infrastructure required to deliver the green hydrogen vision accounts for about 110 billion. Putting all of that together, 400 billion euros, it sounds a lot of money and it is a lot of money, but in the context of European GDP, it's 3% of EU GDP. If you amortize that over 5 years, it's 0.6% per year of EU GDP. This is very doable. It is not a large amount of money in the grand scheme of things. Smart policy from governments in the European Union, combined with smart policy at the pan-European level, and I've already mentioned the important role of the European carbon market, should be able to deliver this vision, because as I say, we already know how to do it in the form of renewable energy. So I am confident that we can deliver in Europe on this vision and help wherever possible show how it can be done to the rest of the world. Although in Asia, I mean, I know the Japanese government is very interested in the idea of green hydrogen. So I very much hope that this is something we will see the European Union cooperating on with other parts of the world, and I'm sure that will happen. We're already seeing some interesting commitments from member state governments. The Spanish government only yesterday, following the German government and the French government, is putting in place measures to encourage green hydrogen production in Spain. So this is a very exciting time as a new low carbon technology starts to take its place. And I think over the next decade, this will be key. If I may conclude with just a quick word on gender diversity in the energy industry, it's absolutely essential. Looking at the data from Bloomberg and from other sources, the energy industry currently has the second lowest level of representation of women in senior managerial positions. The only industry that has a lower representation is the materials industry. And in energy, it's about 18%. So that needs to be improved. And that is why at BNP Paribas Asset Management, we have a very active engagement policy with all of our companies, and it's something we look at closely in particular for the energy industry. We encourage all companies to have at least 30% representation of women on their boards. In developed countries, if they do not have at least 30% representation of women, we vote against those companies at their annual general meeting. And in emerging markets, we want to see at least one female representative on the board of companies. We think it's essential to improve the openness, transparency, all the things that we heard about earlier from Jon, of how energy companies operate, and is very important to us. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and look forward to questions afterwards.
Thank you, Jon and Ogawa-san, for all the hard work putting this session together, and to Tanaka-san for the introduction. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be part of it. Thank you also to the Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, the government of Japan and Prime Minister Abe for conceiving of the ICEF in 2007. The role of the financial sector in addressing acceleration of innovation to address the challenges of climate change is essential. Now, please allow me to introduce myself briefly and give you some context as to my relevance for being here. My experience spans 40 years of multinational innovation investment banking. Part of that time was spent with the great house of Nomura. My specialities are in medicine, information and communications technology, and sustainability. It was actually at Nomura, with Nomura-san, where we pioneered a new investment banking model for innovation, and it worked. The process aligned interest and allowed funds to move more quickly. Part of the reason for its success back in the mid-90s was Nomura-san and my insistence on gender and nationality balance. We built a team of 65 humans from scratch, 45% women, and 25 different first languages. Gender balance was and is fundamental to being successful in our endeavors here today. Innovator Capital, a London-based specialist investment bank, was founded by me in 2003. We provide advisory services to health and sustainable technology companies. We recognize that innovation has a key role to play in accelerating impact on climate change and achieving the 17 broader UN Sustainable Development Goals. Clean Equity Monaco was founded in 2007, same year as Cool Earth, by Prince Albert II of Monaco and myself. Every year, we source over 600 new technologies from all over the planet, and 30 are selected to present at the conference. The objective is that over 2 days, these companies get to meet whoever they need so they may flourish and become self-sustainable in their own right. The 2-day event results in massive savings on time, money, and air travel. So we are absolutely aligned with today's discussion topics. We understand the importance of gender balance, and we recognize the finance gap that exists in funding sustainable technology innovation. Because we've seen it before, and we know how to fix it. The problem is exactly the same. People are scared of science. Innovation is perceived as being too risky. Investment is too long-term, with little in the way of short-term paybacks. And transactions are too small to incentivize investment banks and financial institutions to get involved. I had a conversation the other day with a well-known name on the street. Its transaction committee will not approve a transaction where the fee is less than £5 million. The fee. Many breakthrough technologies we see, the total transaction is half that figure, the total transaction. We don't have to and must not accept this as the status quo. Climate change is here and now, and every year that passes, we see more examples of its devastating direct and indirect effects. So now, it's more urgent than ever for us to find solutions that make rapid, real impact. The COVID crisis has shown us that worldwide, large-scale action is possible. So let's get on with it. No more excuses. Going forward, optimum impact must be at the heart of the approach. The right funding must meet the right innovation as and when it is required. We all know that if revenues are brought forward by 2 years, so are investor returns or shareholder value. We can achieve this with tried and tested investment banking structures and financial instruments. All have been demonstrated in other sectors already. Does anybody here today really think that sustainable technology is more scary than biotechnology? Not only are they not more scary, they don't take 15 years to get through clinical trials and to generate first commercial sales. So innovation will play a central role in achieving net zero. And finance for innovation will only work with gender equality. Ask Jon Moore, he knows. The secret is to align interests for all parties involved, creating one team with all disciplines in concert together. You cannot do that without women. Da Vinci summed it up perfectly, didn't he? Knowing is not enough. We must apply. Being willing is not enough. We must do. So, let's just get on with it, shall we? Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Very wide selection of comments, actually. So there's almost no overlap, which I think truly represents the breadth that we have here. So what I wanted to do was focus a little bit first from a government public perspective, and then from a private perspective, and then maybe touch somewhat on COVID. And what I wanted to do was ask Aleksandra, she mentioned coal in your starting few words. And I know that you've spent a lot of time thinking about the just transition. And I know, as well as investing a lot in clean technologies and ramping that up, there are also some quite big challenges around areas where the current technology is very embedded and communities rely on that. Would you mind sharing a little bit about how the EU has thought about that?
Yes, sure, Jon. As I mentioned in my initial presentation, we have established a just transition mechanism to really help those territories where livelihoods depend on fossil fuels, on carbon-intensive industries, to move really to more sustainable sectors. And so what we have proposed in January this year is a mechanism which is based on 3 pillars. First, we have a Just Transition Fund, which provides grants to the regions that we have pre-identified as being the most reliant on fossil fuel economy. And this is mainly coal regions, to be honest, but also regions which produce coal and oil shale in Europe. And there are still quite a few of them. One could be surprised that in Europe we still have around 30 regions where hard coal and lignite is being mined. And of course, one of the biggest challenges is in Poland, which represents over half of the total employment in coal in the EU. But the challenge is actually quite present in other parts of Europe, in Germany and Hungary and Czechia, Greece. So it is a pan-European challenge, I would say. So we will be providing grants to very selected territories. We have gone in a very micro scale to identify those territories that are really relying to target the communities that are relying on jobs in coal. But we know that subsidies and grants are not enough, because we want to attract this private investment, which is going to stay even after the grants or subsidy schemes run out. So we have created a dedicated mechanism under the Invest EU, so the investment fund we have created, a dedicated window for the just transition regions with reinforced technical assistance, because what we see in those regions is that very often they lack the administrative and technical capacity to build good project proposals. So this is the second pillar. And the third pillar are grants, subsidized grants for public authorities, because we know that a lot of these regions will, for example, have to move to cleaner sources of heating, and this will require investing in brand new infrastructures, perhaps district heating infrastructures. So we will also have a specific scheme for supporting the local authorities in accessing funding for transition. And all together under these three pillars, we are planning to raise 100 billion euros of investments across the EU. And as I said in my preliminary remarks, this is a big challenge. We got most of the EU member states on board with this commitment to phase out coal, but we are still working on a few more, let's say, complicated cases. In Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, there is still no phase out commitment for coal, but the economics are simply so strong in favor of clean energy sources, and the economic reality has changed so much over the last 10 years that it's just simply not a good business anymore to subsidize coal-fired power generation. And we realize that we have to get out of these investments as soon as possible to save also taxpayers' money and put it in places where it can bring a better value to the European citizens.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's often an area that's really not looked at enough as to how to move from incumbent industries. And as you've said, that really does need a program in and of its own right. And I think that's really interesting to see what's happening in Europe. I have another question, one that's come in actually from the viewers around taxonomy and the value of taxonomy, but also when will it be made public? And so I was going to ask Isabelle maybe to comment on that in terms of the value of the taxonomy and your expectations of when you'll sort of start using that in earnest and going from there. Isabelle.
Thank you. Good morning again. So in relation to the taxonomy, I think that what it does, for those that haven't normally come across the word, it just means a classification model. So what it's attempting to do is to classify what is green or what is transitional. And I suppose one of the great difficulties that we have is that that's going to change over time. But it focuses on 6 environmental factors. I think those are quite useful, looking at mitigation, adaptation, water and marine resources, the circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and biodiversity and ecosystems. And only mitigation and adaptation have really been progressed at this point. And the expectation is that it will be made more full and focusing on the others right from the start. But I think what's actually been useful about this is a bit what I mentioned when I talked about our green transition bonds, is that whereas the focus historically has been mostly on renewable energy and energy efficiency, really the focus of the taxonomy has also been on saying it's not enough to start with what is currently green or near zero. We have to look at what we need going forward. And I think that, so they've divided really into 3 sectors, and I think this has been the bit that's particularly useful. So you've got the deep green sector, the zero emissions right now. So that's the sustainable transport and electricity generation that's currently green, and afforestation. But I think that in focusing on the 2 other parts, the transition sector, so saying what is it that we are going to need that will contribute to net zero? So looking at building renovation or electricity generation that's not currently near zero, and also what is enabling. So looking at what enables the deep green and the transition. So, noting that you can't make your wind turbines or your electric cars without better steel production. So it's focusing on all these different aspects. You can't have your green building without better glass manufacturing or without more efficient boilers. So it's all these kinds of aspects that I think have been the particular value of the taxonomy. I think what is difficult is that it focuses on do no significant harm. And in financial markets, that's actually quite a strong level of attestation. What do we really mean by do no significant harm? And I think that having processes is absolutely important to establish where are the risks, what are the mitigants, and so on. So that is an important aspect. But the kinds of attestation that they're talking about may be understood beyond that. And that would be a concern for financial markets as to how easily usable it will be. I think the other difficulty is that they've used NACE codes, which is about activity. So it's looking all at environmental activities. And as we know, projects, investments, assets tend to be a significant number of different activities. So to my mind, being a sort of bond market person, it's much harder, although it will be used in the bond market, than it would be, for instance, for equity markets or corporate reporting, where you could say how much of your income comes from things that relate to the taxonomy. So although it will be used by funds and it will be a requirement for EU funds to use it, I think that it is going to be practically difficult, but clearly not impossible, for it to be used in relation to projects and investments. And we will find a way of doing that kind of translation. I think the one other difficulty that's worth mentioning is that, of course, for the transition and enabling activities, there will be changes every 3 years as to what the technical criteria are and what is the level of ambition of projects at that stage. And of course, with long-dated instruments, that constant changing is going to be a factor that will be somewhat challenging. But I think that certainly for the EU Green Bond Standard, there is consideration which will ask for any use of proceeds of green bonds to be related to the taxonomy directly. It will, of course, be important that they start grandfathering any transactions that relate to technical standards from 2 years ago or 3 years ago, because otherwise bonds would go in and out of being valid or not valid. And one last thing to mention is that it very much focuses on activities happening in the EU and standards that relate to the EU. Of course, there are many that will seek to use it, or who aren't in the EU, or who have projects that are not in the EU. And therefore, the translation against standards is another thing that will be challenging for many. But I think the importance is that we start to have a language that we can all speak, and that we start to understand what are the objectives and how we may achieve those, and what kinds of levels of ambition are expected. And that gives greater certainty to the market.
Great. And I have a quick follow-up question to that for you, Isabelle, too. So it sounds like the taxonomy is evolving and becoming clearer, but you're sort of recommending that people look at it now because, in future when people come to decide what's green and what isn't, everything that's sort of compliant will be included. So A, starting to understand it now, and B, for people not in Europe, would you recommend it as a good framework for people to really start using, even if it may not become, legislation in their region?
Yes, I think it's important to understand because many people will have investors from Europe, so that's going to be important to be able to communicate with them. But I think also just looking at that broader spectrum of what is going to be needed for us to achieve the goals of 2050, and looking at the separate objectives. So in some geographies, something like pollution prevention and control may be the number one aspect that they're focusing on even more than climate mitigation, although that's important.
In others, climate adaptation is going to be significantly important. So looking at what is understood from the EU taxonomy perspective will indeed be very helpful, I think, for them in deciding how things may be determined in their geography, or what investors are going to seek to understand, because they're going to have their own reporting requirements.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. We also have some questions around TCFD. I know in Japan in particular, TCFD is extremely high profile, and is another great way of companies reporting climate risk, and investors understand it. So I'm actually going to ask Mark about his views on the sort of value of TCFD, and we have one specific question actually around whether the gender pay gap should be included in TCFD. It's currently not, but there's a very specific question that said, should disclosure of the gender pay gap be included? So Mark, your thoughts on TCFD in that question in particular?
Yes, thank you, John. Well, I should also add that in addition to being a very avid user of the TCFD recommendations, I helped to draw them up because I'm a member of the TCFD, and I've been on the TCFD since 2016. I mean, if I may say a few words on the TCFD itself, I think I've been very pleasantly surprised by the impacts that it has had and continues to have. And I think it's a testament to Mark Carney's vision and prescience in establishing it, because the real genius of the TCFD is contained in the speech that Mark Carney gave to the London insurance market, Lloyd's of London, in September 2015, which was 3 months before the TCFD was set up. And what he really said was, look, if we're going to solve the problem of climate change, we need a fundamental structural shift in the way that markets think about climate change and the risk it poses to the value of financial investments. That's really what this is about. And his fundamental point is, in order for the market to be able to deliver a smooth response to the risk that poses, that climate change poses over time, and to avoid the tremendous financial destabilization that could otherwise occur if markets are not quick enough to respond to this challenge, the markets are going to need more information from companies, because markets are only as good as the information upon which they can discover prices is based. And markets are all about price discovery. If you don't have the information, then markets won't be able to price things efficiently and correctly. And there is a phrase in Mark Carney's speech, which if you haven't read it, I would encourage everybody to read. The speech is called Breaking the Tragedy of the Horizon. And the phrase is, the purpose of setting up a task force on climate-related financial disclosure is really about setting up a market in the transition to a 2-degree world. Different market participants will have different views on the severity and urgency of the climate crisis, and it will be for them to, as it were, make their bets. But we need a level playing field, and we need as much information as possible for investors to make those bets, and therefore we need full disclosure from companies. So I think it's been a very interesting last 4 years, because as that information has started to come, and we still need many more companies to sign up to it, but I, like you, John, I would very much like to pay tribute to Japan and the Japanese government for the tremendous efforts they have made to bring corporate Japan on board with this. And Japan now has, I think, more companies signed up to the TCFD than any other country in the world. And that's really remarkable, and a tremendous achievement on the part of the Japanese, the entire Japanese corporate sector and government. And really the success of it is precisely because of Mark Carney's point. As you give more information to markets, markets can ask more well-informed questions, and companies start to see that there's a benefit in disclosing, because they will get a higher ranking from the market on this. So I think, that's been the benefit of it. As you produce more, as Mark Carney says, supply creates its own demand. That's really the fundamental point. There's more to be done, but I think it's having a tremendous effect, and it's helping different jurisdictions, I think it's fed into the thoughts about the EU taxonomy that Isabelle was talking about. So it's percolating through the financial system via an explicit and implicit pathways, and I think it will continue to inform this debate. On the specific subject of the gender pay gap, I think it's absolutely essential that companies report on that, but the TCFD has a specific remit around climate change. So where there are specific questions relating to the impact of climate risk that companies are running on different, the gender gap, I think that's relevant. On pay itself, remuneration, I think that's more a topic for general corporate governance standards within individual jurisdictions. But certainly, again, we at BNP Paribas Asset Management take that very seriously, and we do all we can in terms of our engagement with companies to encourage them to be as transparent as possible on this point. It's absolutely essential. It's just a fundamental question of equality here, and in the 21st century, there is no excuse any longer for these practices to continue.
Thank you, Mark. I think it was a very clear answer there, which was yes, definitely. Let's move on to something that we haven't touched on yet, a bit more on the innovation side. And I wanted to actually start by asking Aleksandra a little bit about R&D and just how R&D fits into, how have people thought about R&D and innovation in sort of, as Mungo pointed out, there are many challenges to get innovation up and running. How have the European Commission thought about supporting R&D for new technologies that are needed? Aleksandra.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. Well, we have a dedicated fund to support research and development and innovation, and that's Horizon Europe. And under this fund, we will be running a specific call on Green Deal, and over the next 7 years, we will be allocating more resources to innovation via this fund. But we also set aside some of the emission allowances under the EU ETS and created what we call an innovation fund, which is currently ongoing with the first call. And I don't know if you remember, but we used to have a fund called NER 300, for which we have been financing in the past CCS projects and highly innovative renewables. This is sort of a successor to this fund, and we definitely see a lot of sectors where innovation has to be supported. And Mark mentioned green hydrogen. Definitely, this is one of the areas where we still need research and development support, whether it is for retrofitting the current infrastructure that we have for gas so that it can also support green hydrogen deployment, when it comes to electrolyzers and making sure that the cost of electrolyzers drops in Europe, all with the aim to support these long-term targets that we have, for example, for green hydrogen. So I would say that our research and innovation policy, is clearly one of the key areas which we have to align with our Green Deal priorities. And just to perhaps zoom in on this issue of green hydrogen, as Mark mentioned, we have published in July a strategy on hydrogen, which of course comes at a very good time because a lot of our member states are currently pledging capacities for 2030. And for example, 4 gigawatts by 2030 coming from Spain is the most recent one. What we want to have in the EU is 40 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2030, with a strong focus on green hydrogen. So produced from renewables. So I think that we have to make sure that we work together with the industry, and that we are making sure that the projects that we are funding are really in this area where they are close to the market and just need additional support from the public institutions to help us reach our goals, really.
Thank you very much. What I wanted to do is bring Mungo in now and ask him really about, from investing in innovation, his thoughts on, the government support and the various government funds, plus other sources of funds, and sort of what's the most important thing to make sure that these innovations that are clearly needed get the right funding to scale and bring the cost down, as Mark said, until with scale you bring the cost down, which begets more scale. So for some of these technologies at the beginning of that cycle, what are the most important things, and how do you view those government funds, Mungo?
Well, thank you, John. In fact, what I do is I echo what Aleksandra, Isabelle, and Mark said. It's incentive. How can you incentive the whole capital markets to actually get involved in innovation? And the big issue has been that the transaction sizes are too small. But as I said in my presentation earlier, we did it in the biotech sector. Not only did we do it in the biotech sector, but it was absolutely proven to accelerate innovation, get it out there, and work with dealing with patients who have incurable diseases. I wrote a paper some years ago for the previous American administration and a previous UK administration, suggesting that they should abolish something that didn't exist. And that was capital gains on investment in sustainable technology investment. There weren't any. There were no capital gains. So if there aren't any, abolish them. So what if the EU made a member-wide decision that as of January the 1st of 2021, there will no longer be any capital gains tax on innovation? And this is really important. What is the definition of innovation? There are lots of funds out there that say they invest in innovation. Great names. I'm not going to point the finger at them, but we only invest a minimum of 25 million, or they have to have 25 million in revenue. That is not innovation, that's growth. And as I said in my presentation earlier, we source over 600 technologies a year from all over the world, but these really are, in biotech terms, these are preclinical. And the question I saw that came up earlier on the Paris Agreement, this is Article 10. Article 10 is very clear. All parties that signed up to that, which in the end was all countries, will support innovation of technologies to address climate change and sustainability, and they will share it. And I think that's possibly one of the ways. One of the other ways is for Aleksandra and I to talk to each other next week, for Isabelle and I, and Mark and I to talk to each other, and how can we actually pull this together? Now, that capital gains issue could actually be structured slightly more easily, where certainly in Europe and in Japan and in America, there are expert fund managers. So structure the fund, so Fidelity or somebody launches a fund where capital gains is 0, but the fund's charter is absolutely focused on investing in innovation. For years and years, the first job I ever had in 1975, I was selling drilling funds. So anybody could invest in a drilling fund. If the hole was a duster, i.e. there was nothing there, it was all written off against tax. And if it wasn't a duster and oil or gas flooded out of it, the investor didn't need to pay tax on that either, from the revenue of the gas or the oil that was sold. So all of this has been done before, and there are ways to do it, and there are ways for governments also not to feel that this is a bottomless pit. There are ways to recycle that capital and to have it coming back to them so they can recycle it again, and where innovators themselves don't feel threatened that they're going to lose all the equity in the companies that they've founded. But I believe that's the only thing I've ever done in my life. So it's one of the only things that I actually understand. But I'm very happy to work with Mark and Isabelle and Aleksandra, share my thoughts and experiences of where we got it wrong and where we got it right. And I think, yes, I think there's a lot that government can do. And clearly listening to Aleksandra and Isabelle this morning is, somebody's actually making a move. They really are.
Great. Thank you for that, Mungo. And actually, you touched on a very good point in terms of connecting the dots across all of the different players in this, because I think that really is extremely important alignment to really get plans in place and people on the same page. I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I have sort of one fairly broad question for everybody, actually, which is around sectors and which sector you would recommend that is key to focus on right now, and also in relation to Japan, if you have any specific views on whether that's the same or different for Japan. So just the sort of the sectoral view, if you had to choose in terms of priorities now, which is the top thing that you would say in Japan people should really focus on. So I'm going to start with Mungo. If you would like to start on that, that would be great.
Okay, the most controversial one. I think there is a new nuclear energy age, and Japan is a huge player in this. Yes, we know that 1 gram of uranium produces 60 megawatts of electricity a day, or 3 tons of coal, or 600 gallons of oil would do that. But there is some new technology. And Japan is involved because GE, Hitachi have probably the most relevant piece of hardware from a reactor point of view. That's the 10th iteration. Costs have dropped 60%. And they also have the finest steam generators. But the secret sauce to it is a fuel, a new fuel that can go into any reactor that, instead of processing at 1300 degrees, processes at 300 degrees or operates at 300 degrees. That's the same temperature as a pizza oven. So if everybody thinks that this is something dangerous, then they're going to have to shut every pizza oven in the world. Not only does it deal with the safety issue, but it deals with the non-proliferation issue. The spent fuel cannot be weaponized. Furthermore, 95% or 94.7% of the pollution involved with the spent fuel is also gone. Oh, and it also produces 30% more electricity. So what it does is it removes all of the negative issues around nuclear energy, and I think nuclear energy has to be a part of this if we really want to achieve net zero in the foreseeable future. So I'd like to add nuclear energy to the agenda with everybody at some point in the future, because I think now, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, and I would have said, not on your life would I ever have anything to do with it. But it has changed, and it's technology innovation that's changed it. So that's my brief answer to your question, John.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Isabelle, I would ask you the same in terms of a sector, and particularly where it's relevant for Japan?
May I answer it in relation to environmental objectives? Because I think that would be helpful. I hear a lot when I come to Japan with Japanese investors about actually climate mitigation, and I hear also a lot about the social agenda. So there's a very significant support from pension funds and insurance companies for the social agenda. So when we issue social bonds, helping microfinance and those kinds of things, they're very focused on that in our health bonds. But I think the bit that we've seen much less focus on has been on climate adaptation, climate mitigation, which I think is going to be very much part of the agenda. And I think it was always seen as the slightly sort of weak sister. You know, it didn't look sufficiently ambitious, so people don't really talk about it. But, you know, even with the time frame that we're talking about, we are going to need, and we are already seeing the effects, and we need to be more galvanized now. And I think the biodiversity agenda also was very much in the background and is important, and it's relevant to things like COVID. So we have very much a sort of sense that these are things that we need to give greater focus to, or as greater focus to as we do climate mitigation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Adaptation and biodiversity. Aleksandra, same question.
Well, I would see really two immediate priorities on which the EU and Japan could definitely work hand in hand, because it is a huge challenge for us, and one longer term priority. So I would say as really the focus for the next 10 years for us in Europe will be how to reduce emissions from our building stock and how to reduce emissions from transport. So just to give you an idea, if we want to reach our new targets that we have just proposed for 2030, we will have to reduce the emissions from the building stock by 60% in Europe. We will have to double our renovation rate in a sector which is very difficult to tackle, because we're talking about a lot of small-scale projects that are more difficult to finance than large-scale industrial projects. So working on accelerating building renovation and understanding how to build these projects and how to finance them, and sharing best practices on higher electrification rates in buildings, it's definitely an important priority. The second immediate one would be transport, because as much as, for example, in the EU, we have seen huge progress in decarbonizing power generation. Transport has actually increased its emissions by 20% recently. So we definitely need to focus more on e-mobility, electric cars over the next decade. And Japan being an industrial powerhouse in the automobile sector, I see a lot of potential for cooperation in that area as well. And from a longer term perspective, what we definitely need to have as part of this Green Deal puzzle is low carbon industry. And a lot can be done already by improving efficiencies and moving to electrification over the next decade. But what we need is real solutions to move it to net zero via hydrogen, via CCUS maybe. And again, I think this is also a priority on which major economies such as the EU and Japan should be cooperating strongly. But in order to get there, I think we need two important enabling sectors, and that's low carbon electricity based largely on renewables and low carbon gases. So I'm really looking forward to see how Japan is going to support large scale renewables and low carbon gases, including hydrogen in the future.
Thank you very much. That was quite a big list, actually. You covered quite a lot of ground there, but that was great. Thanks. And Mark, fine, I'd ask you the same question. Sort of, what's the priority for now?
Yes, well, I think Aleksandra's really hit the nail on the head there. I think if you're going to decarbonize beyond the power sector, particularly industry and buildings and transportation. It's more electrification, and it's low carbon gases, most notably green hydrogen. And I know the Japanese government has been looking at this for a long time. The Japanese government sponsored the IEA's work on the future of hydrogen in 2019 when the Japanese government held the presidency of the G20. So I think that's a very obvious area for Japan to really become a global leader. And work closely with the European Union. Having followed the climate change debate and how financial markets look at climate change for 15 years now, it's very clear that once you get, people have this idea that decarbonization is very expensive, but as this entire panel session has showed, once you get innovation going, you get this virtuous feedback loop and costs fall very quickly. So we really should be thinking imaginatively. Yes, there might be an upfront cost, but it will be more than compensated by the benefits that will flow over time. And as the IPCC and Sir Nicholas Stern and many other eminent authorities have told us for a very long time now, it's much cheaper to do everything we can to mitigate the impact of climate change today, rather than face the costs of devastating climate change, even more devastating climate change in the future. So we need lots of different solutions, but green hydrogen, I think, is one where the Japanese government has already signaled strong interest, and I think that's an area where some of Japan's companies already have leadership positions. So that seems a very obvious one for me.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So we're run out of time. So first off, I want to say thank you very much for all the panelists for sharing your initial thoughts, and also in the follow-on discussion. We actually touched on quite a lot in the follow-on discussion we touched on sort of policies, particularly around the just transition, taxonomy, and green bonds. We touched on TCFD and relation to gender, and R&D, and how all of that needs to be aligned and incorporated into all of those plans. And then in terms of sectors and technologies, quite a lot on hydrogen. Hydrogen came up many times. Nuclear came back into the discussion, let's say. Adaptation and biodiversity. Buildings, transport, and industry, which I think are the sort of, some of the sort of classic alongside power sectors to decarbonize, and then the balance of sort of electricity and green gas, and the idea of this virtuous circle of sort of investment, cost reduction, more investment, etc., which I think is probably one of the secrets to acceleration, which is really what we need here, is to accelerate the transition and have finance be an absolute key part of that. So once again, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, everybody who could join this session. I hope you found it really interesting and useful, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Thank you.